Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of 2030, the podcast, where we're focused on all things about people and the world of work. And today I'm really pleased to have Sara Matthews as my guest. Sara is the founder of ODISEE, which is an esteemed consultancy really focused on the world of diversity and inclusion and working with corporates on that, particularly in the world of sport, entertainment, etc. So glad to have Sara. I knew Sara back when she was the HR director of Chelsea Football Club, so I'm really keen to explore her experience of that, and particularly as a woman in sport and someone of authority in sport who, played a big role in that transformation at Chelsea. So, Sara, good morning, welcome, and great to have you on the podcast.
Morning, Steve. Lovely to be here. Thank you.
Might be good to start off. Just maybe you can walk us through how you got to where you're at right now.
Yeah, for sure. So, when I finished university, I did a degree in business and I specialised in HR. And I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life once I'd done that. And I ended up working for Staples Office Superstores in the operations team. So I got a really good retail background right out at the start, out of graduating, and really enjoyed it there. And moved through that organization and ended up being their international HR manager. And was really lucky, had some great opportunities, was given some opportunities by senior people in that organization. And I went from there to Wix and Travis Perkins, focused it all. And that was an 8-year stint where we did 3 mergers. So again, loads of really fantastic experience working in the HR department. After that, went to Ladbrokes Betting and Gaming and spent 10 years with them, culminating in being their group HR director with 20,000 people across the UK and internationally. And then the final kind of role before I started ODISEE was at Chelsea Football Club, as you said, as their HR director. So I've been blessed with 25 years of great jobs in some pretty challenging industries, and then decided that I wanted to really focus on diversity and inclusion in sport and entertainment. It's something that's really close to my heart, and wanted to really work with sports organisations to try and create a more inclusive environment for people working in those sectors, and giving people the opportunities from different types of backgrounds to work in sport. And so that's kind of why I specialised, I suppose, a couple of years ago when I started up ODISEE. So that's a very potted history, but I'm sure you've got questions.
Yeah. I mean, I've got a few already, and I really want to talk about some of the industries you've worked in particularly. But just wanted to ask. I mean, when people talk to me about my career, I describe myself as an accidental recruiter. I went to an agency to get a job, to change jobs, and they said, "Do you want to become a recruiter?" And I'd never heard of this. What is this? So I gave it a go, and that was 37 years ago. It was an accident. Did you get into HR and into the people side of business consciously because of what you're interested in, or you started off sort of a business career, or working for a company and ended up in HR?
Yeah, I don't think it was a conscious decision, to be quite honest. I think when I was at university, you go back that far, you didn't have the same choices of the types of courses that they have today. There wasn't that myriad of different things that you could do. So when you did a business degree, and I thought business degree would be good because that would kind of cover lots of different things. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I think we had 3 choices. You could do marketing, finance, or HR. And that seemed to be the lesser of the 3 evils, really. So I chose HR. Didn't really know what it was. And back in those days, it was very like trade unions. It wasn't about people management and talent development and all of the great stuff we do today. So it wasn't necessarily the sort of where I ended up in the HR spectrum either, because it was very sort of specific to sort of that trade union type employee relations, industrial relations type stuff. I mean, we're talking a long time ago. But I think as I went into retail, which was a very people focused business, and it was sort of from there that I developed an interest in pay and benefits, which was the area that I predominantly specialised in for the former part of my career. And that sort of developed over time, because it started off as very much like, what do you get paid? What benefits do you get? And that then developed into engagement and equity and equality and creating more inclusive environments. So I was really lucky I was in that journey early on in my career of specializing and being in an area that was really developing. And that was the kind of key piece for me, because it was so interesting. I think, I never sat down and said, that's what I want to do with my career. And I know many learning and development leads over the years have said, what was your 5-year plan? And did you have a strategy of what you wanted to do? And I never did. I just did the roles, or took roles that I thought would be really interesting, where I could make a difference. And I was really lucky. I worked for some really great organizations during that time.
Yeah, those organizations, interesting, right? So, I mean, I don't want to jump straight onto this because it sounds sort of slightly cliched, but you know, one of the things that I know about you is, you're incredibly commercial in your approach. And, HR, probably old school HR, used to be accused of not necessarily being so commercial. But I also then think about the companies you work for. And as a woman in a professional executive environment, you pick pretty male dominated sectors. I mean, Wix, you know, um, Chelsea Football Club, very blokey. I mean, how is having not so much, because the point I'm getting to is that a lot of times executive HR roles are kind of tokenistic. That's where, for some organizations that are a bit crusty, that's where a woman fits onto the board or whatever. But that's not your deal. I mean, you've always been sort of at the edge. You're very commercial. You're a contributor at that level. How did you find it coming through those very male dominated environments that, HR had a voice, and that, you were making the impact that you wanted to?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think being in the reward specialism probably helped, because it's so specialized and it's very data and financially driven. So, for example, you're looking at your organization's bonus plans, their share plans. So you're quite a technical person in the HR department. And so you're sort of moving away from that traditional kind of personnel admin type role, which I don't, that has a place, but I think these days HR is so much more than that, and about talent and development. But I think back in those days, I was almost in the really sharp end of HR. I was in the kind of the bit that was very much around how the business performed. So I was really lucky, because I could talk very commercially. I had to understand my business. I had to understand what drove the business, because if you don't know that, then you can't build a bonus plan, a share plan, create the right pay structures, have the right grading structures. So it was very specific, I think, around the role that I did. And I remember early on, a lot of people were moving into sort of business partnering roles, and they said, "Oh, you're crazy to do reward. It's all numbers, and it's not an area that's going to develop in the same way as a business partner role." And to be honest, I think I probably was actually right, because it was the area that got the best exposure to the rest of the business. You just ended up being so involved with other parts of the business. And then if you take that into the retail context, certainly at Ladbrokes or somewhere like that, I was working with everyone from the shop floor right through to the PLC board. So you got to understand and be involved in all the different parts of the business, whether that was an incentive campaign at shop level, or a executive bonus plan or share plan at the senior level. So I think I picked the right thing for me, and I picked something that was very commercial, because you had to understand the business in order to do it. So I think you kind of were perceived in a slightly different way. But I think you're right. You could be tokenistic, and I think luckily I found a bit of a niche, which meant that they needed that role, and that was the role that I fulfilled. And I was pretty good at numbers and stuff, and enjoyed it. I really enjoyed that side of it. So I think that gave me those opportunities.
Yeah, and I think you and I share a common interest in inclusion. And one of the things that I find difficult is that if companies are inclusive, for example, it stands to reason that there's an equitable mix of gender and people of different backgrounds at senior level in organizations, because that's just how society is. And yet that's still not the case. And I find that immensely frustrating. Now, in your work in diversity with ODISEE, um, what are the major obstacles you come up against? What are the major challenges you see businesses being confronted with?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sports world is particularly interesting. You and I both agree that sport has got an enormous amount of power to influence wider society, whether that's at a grassroots level or at an international level. And you only have to look at women's football as an example to see that there's a lot of strength and power in that. My concern is that it still feels like sport is behind the curve in terms of that inclusivity, in terms of having different people from different backgrounds involved in the upper echelons of sport. Yes, there probably is more women, but are there women from different backgrounds? Are there men from different backgrounds? People from underrepresented groups? And I just don't feel like it's moving very quickly. And quite often, I'll talk to organisations. They're like, "Well, we're looking for more diversity," but I'm not sure they're looking in the right places. It takes effort. It does take effort, and I just wonder if organisations are really making that effort as much as they could, and really creating environments for people to come into that are inclusive. Because it's great, you can do tons of diversity, you can bring lots of different people in, but if when they get there, it's not a place they want to work, they'll churn through and leave, and kind of all of that hard work is wasted. And I still feel that sport has got a long way to go, and I think that's an interesting kind of challenge, because I don't think it does necessarily reflect the communities that it serves on occasion. And I think some organisations have done a brilliant job, but I think there's a lot of organisations that have got a lot of work to do to create a more inclusive environment and a fair environment.
Yeah, 100%. It's interesting, because I'm a bit of a sports nerd, and I've been watching the Women's World Cup. We're recording this at semi-final stage. Well, we've got Australia England, ironically, tomorrow.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Maybe we won't be speaking
Clearly
after
will
that.
be winning.
But well, uh, technically, without going down a whole rabbit hole, I suspect we're pretty happy where we've gotten so far, based on lots of things. But two things I was going to say in observation. One, I was reading some media that was the single largest television audience in Australia since the Olympic Games in 2000 in Sydney. And it was a women's football event. The stadium was sold out with 78,000 people. Um, and, online, even my mum, in her 80s, she rang me she was so excited about the result. So it has the power to shift mindset, and that women's football, that's had a huge impact. I mean, taking it to Australia has been a great thing. Um, but I was also interested, I read this, I've read a book recently called Crickonomics, which it's a hardcore cricket nerd book. But one of the things interesting in there is the International Cricket Council, their investment in women's cricket is fundamentally focused on developing countries where there is no preeminent women's sport. And they believe that by investing in cricket in Brazil or Thailand, countries like that, they can become the number one women's sport, which obviously is there's a commercial angle on that, but I'm not sure if it's that diverse, and they're not necessarily tackling, although cricket has done a good job, not tackling that issue in the markets that they are involved in. I mean, do you think sometimes the commercial reality outweighs the social upside of inclusion and diversity?
Um, it's an interesting question, because I think certainly at the major international stages, women's sport and maybe lesser known sports do need to be able to hold their own. And obviously, we know that sports have been kind of subsidised over the years. But I think, you have to remember back to, for example, women's football in the UK. It was banned, so there was no opportunity for it to be commercially viable sooner than 1971, because
No, I didn't know.
the FA banned football. Um, and so, you're going to be behind the curve. But I think the opportunities now, I think organizations, sponsoring organizations are much more savvy to women's sport, and the ability to be able to sponsor a sport and to be involved in a sport. You've got someone like Vitality and netball, etc. So you start to get a real presence around these things. um, I think at an international level, it's really difficult. And you look at some of the teams that have done very well in the women's World Cup, who have got very little support, very little financial backing, in order to have done as well as they have. They've sort of done it in spite of the financial support they get. So I think it's an evolution. I think there are definitely elements of women's sport that will get high profile commercial parts to it, and I think women's football is one of those. And I would like to see football being an area that is the leader, the game changer, the template for how to grow sports for the future. And I think that's a great opportunity, and I think they're doing that really well. But there's a lot still to do. I mean, recently a review has come out led by Karen Carney around women's football in England, and how that needs to be reviewed and invested and supported in a different way for it to continue to grow and flourish. So there's a lot to do behind the scenes, as well as the great, it's great to have almost 80,000 people come and watch a match. Same's happened at Wembley. That's fantastic, but it's got to be sustainable over the long term, and it's got to kind of happen week in, week out, like it does with the men's leagues, and that's where we need to get to.
Yeah, and I think that's true. You and I share a lot of common, vision and thoughts around diversity and inclusion. But I guess where I come from, is sort of that inclusion side. That at the end of the day, it's football, right? And people should be able to participate at their local club, and they
Yeah.
should be welcomed into that environment, and for local clubs, all that stuff's got to filter down. So young people of whatever their background or their gender or orientation can get involved, not just in sport, but in business. And that leads me on to this question about something we've talked about before. So COVID, I do a lot of work in disability inclusion, as you know, but there was this kind of perception that the lockdown work from home revolution would open things up for people with disability in the world of work, but it hasn't actually played out that way. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, or apart from frustration?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we have chatted about it, and I think it's really disappointing, because I think there's a massive opportunity, and it's not just about physical disability, but also there are neurodiversity, etc., which may hamper someone from sort of maybe doing what might be perceived as the norm of going into an office every day, and doing what might be considered sort of more traditional work day. And I genuinely thought that, and maybe I was naive, but I genuinely thought that following lockdown, the fact that everybody had been at home, that we were using technology in a different way, that you could structure your day differently, and have still completely committed to work, but in a more flexible environment, would definitely open up more opportunities for people who perhaps couldn't or were hampered by that sort of normal working day of getting on a tube or getting in a car or doing whatever. And that could be for millions of different reasons. It could be anxiety, it could be a disability, it could be all sorts of things. But I really thought that that would be a great opportunity for businesses to think differently about their recruitment processes, to open up their world of work in a different way, and maybe attract people from different backgrounds, because we weren't geographically set in one place, we weren't physically set in one place, and that meant that people could, hopefully get opportunities that maybe hadn't existed before because they could do that in work in a different way. And I'm super disappointed that we seem to have missed that opportunity, because I think it would have been and it's not gone. It doesn't mean people couldn't listen to this and go, oh, actually, yeah, that's a really good point. But I just think there's so much skill out there, and we're missing a talent pool if we don't tap into, people that maybe just can't work in that more traditional way. And we don't need to these days, because, the world of work is different. I think work is, though, trying to find the right place. So we all went out and were working at home, and then some organisations have said you never have to come back. That doesn't seem like the right answer. And then some organisations are like, no, we want everybody back in now, like the old days, if you like. And that doesn't seem right either. So we've got to find the right way, the right place in the spectrum. But I think that needs to also accommodate people who, need to work in a different way. And I just don't see how we can't do that in this day and age. And I think that's, as I say, maybe I'm naive, but I'm a bit disappointed by that, because I thought it was a great opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, likewise. I mean, I thought it was as well. I mean, humanity returned. Everyone cared about everybody, and in lockdown, we're all worried about your neighbour and everybody else, and then kind of things have just gone back to normal. And there was this sort of paradigm shift that we could have taken an opportunity on, and we didn't. And yet, I get it's not frustrating, because inclusion means there's a lot of different ways to look at that. But at the moment, for example, over 50s has become a big government focus, and it's a kind of a popularist thing. How do we get people over 50 back into the workforce that in COVID just kind of exited, decided not to work, or there are skills where the market needs those skills. And I find it a bit baffling that the government doesn't have a more holistic kind of approach to the idea of inclusion, whether it be disability or otherwise, because there are highly skilled people out there in, under the broader category of disability. A lot of disability categories are invisible, and they don't impact people's ability to work. It might mean that they have to have different commute patterns, or in fact work from home or whatever. But it's not difficult to do, and yet it's just a hot potato companies don't really want to grab onto at the moment. They still, there are some companies doing amazing things, but I read a stat, that 4 out of 5 companies want disability inclusion to be part of everything they do, but 2 in 10 have actually managed to do something about it. And I just don't see it like you. I don't see it as a massive transition, and I think there is lots of really amazing people out there that just don't get an opportunity. I think the other thing for government is, obviously, a lot of people on disability receive welfare, and they want to become taxpayers, and the government's looking for volunteers to pay tax. So it's anyway, it's another story. I mean, where do you so all that into account, and your vast experience across lots of different things. Um, when we think forward, because this podcast is really about 2030, it's not that far in the future, and we hear about AI and technology and globalization, remote working, all this sort of stuff. But if you stop and think, I mean, what's the world of work look like in 2030 from your perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose 10 years ago, if you said, what does the world of 2023 look like? I don't know if I would have guessed it would have been a bit more technology enabled. I mean, the first thing that sort of, I don't know, kind of is such a surprise is how little we were using technology in the way that we do now. We literally woke up one morning and suddenly everyone was on Teams and Zoom and what have you, and we weren't all jumping on trains and getting in cars and traveling to meetings, and everything was a little bit more agile. I think that will continue, but as I said, I think there's this spectrum of, we were all locked up at home, working from home, managing kids at home, all the massive things people were doing, which was really stressful for people. And I think then organizations were very much like, you never have to come back. I think they've changed their minds on that because it's not very practical. But I think you lose a lot of your intercommunication skills if you don't see people in person just a bit. I think you pick up a lot of things in the workplace from being with other people. I think work is a social enterprise as well as a work enterprise. Lots of people have made friends over the years that they met at work. So that it's a really important part of your kind of social interaction. So I do think that this kind of everyone works from home or virtually or whatever that is not necessarily the right. I think we're going to lose some human skills if we don't interact together in a more physical sense. I do think that technology is a way of it's a good way of making things more efficient. I think back to the times when I've left home at 6 in the morning to get to a meeting somewhere at 10 in the morning, and you're traveling for 4 hours and or traveling. I did a lot of traveling overseas, and that doesn't necessarily need to happen, which I think is a good thing, because it's an enormous amount of time that's spent doing that, and it's very tiring for people. And it eats into your personal life significantly. So I think there's ways of balancing those things. I think when you come to AI, I mean, that's an interesting topic at the moment and very topical at the moment. I do think AI has a place in efficiency, helping us to be more efficient. I think we talked a bit about jobs as being tasks. There's a series of tasks, and I think there's a lot of tasks that can be automated so that we can use people's inspirational sides, use their inventive sides for other things in the world of work, rather than just sort of the more task orientated activities. But 2030, I think, I'm not sure it's going to look a huge amount different to what it does today. I think we might have slightly balanced that spectrum of finding a way of being physically at a work location and working from home. I think we'll have worked out what flexible working means, because I'm not sure it means the same thing to people. Everyone seems to have a slightly different definition of flexible working. I think there'll still be companies that are absolutely brilliant at really engaging their workforces, getting them to be super productive, and they're working in a flexible way. And I think there'll still be organizations that are really struggling with, what does that mean? They almost don't want to commit. And I think, that's a bit of a challenge. But I think using technology is definitely going to help to create a more efficient workforce. And that's not taking jobs away from people, because I think you're developing the roles that people do versus the roles that are tech based. So 2030, I think, is going to be not so, it's only 7 years away. It's not that dissimilar probably to today, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting again because I agree on some of the things that you just said, and a few not so much in that. I think that the pace of change. One of the things I think dictates that pace of change is going to be. It appears to me, talking to people and research and attending conferences and events, that the big companies are forming their own way to do things. They're kind of breaking away, and they're looking at much more tech-enabled solutions. They're much more advanced on this notion of task or skills-based work, where they're starting to break things down because they've got the luxury of scale. They've got the luxury of, say, global workforces where they can, move things around. And they're looking much more heavily at kind of industrial applications of AI through matching, sourcing, communicating, nurturing, the whole thing. So for me, there's this sort of delamination of the talent market. The mid tier, I agree with you. I think that will remain broadly the same, in spite of the fact that AI and other things will be available. The budgets to do it, the fear factor, the need for people. So it's going to be interesting where the talent goes, because people that want that more holistic kind of authentic traditional work experience are going to gravitate to mid-tier growth businesses, which may be a good thing, because that's where the jobs get created, and that's where growth in the economy comes. And governments, I think would support that kind of initiative. Like we've seen other things like the .com bubble, and we've seen that kind of entrepreneurial startup, funky brands and high valuations. But I think that mid tier of traditional businesses is going to go through a really purple patch in terms of being able to secure talent, because people that want a more rounded job in the bigger companies are going to find more and more orientation towards tasks. And that's where, I'm sort of half in awe of AI and I'm half scared of it. The doomsday sayers suggest it's going to take hundreds of millions of jobs because it's smarter than people. But then I'm a humanist, so for me, people need people. We need socially, as you said, to be in the same space. We need to build relationships. We're needy as a species, and therefore, work's an important part of that. So, it'll be interesting to see where it goes. I mean, the techies are all, out there building loads and loads of different, talent tech to replace people, but I'm not so sure. Maybe in the big companies. So, I
Yeah,
think 2030 is going to be.
yeah, I think you're right. And I think there's always those leaders, isn't there? There's always those that are going to try and do stuff differently and lead, be thought leaders, and, you know, um, really kind of push the envelope on these things. And I think that's good. I think that is good. I think you do need to have different tiers of people and different tiers of organizations, and different ways of working, because I think if those really big organizations who've got the money to invest and research, etc., and try things differently, they set the scene for the future. And they have the ability to succeed and fail and move on and create different ways of thinking. But I genuinely believe that, as you say, as a humanist, that whatever tasks that we put and we create that are through a technology based solution, you will always need people's thoughts, feelings, emotions, all of that side of it is part of work. And you know, creating those social structures at work, but doing that in a really inclusive way. And that's the bit that, coming back to that, is that inclusion of that when people come to work, it's somewhere that they enjoy being. I always am so sad when I hear someone say, "Oh, I hate my job and I hate the people I work with, and it's really horrible environment," because so much of your life is spent at work. And we're not all going to love it every day. I think that's naive, but genuinely enjoying what you do and having good working relationships is really important. And I just don't think that's going to, by 2030, I don't think that's going to have disappeared. I think that's still going to be an important part of it. And I think because people are scared or reticent about AI, they'll also push back at that taking over too quickly. And hopefully we can again find, there's always a happy middle ground for these things, I believe.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess that inclusion agenda, you and I and many others are trying to encourage the world down that road, because, it's so important that all of us get involved. I mean, if you can do the job, you should have the opportunity to do the job, and people shouldn't, make that judgment. I mean, again, I'm hopeful that, young people that I talk to on the whole would appear to have a much more hardwired, inclusive set of ideas about things. And therefore, as they get into their career in a deeper way, they'll have more influence over the way organizations operate. So, perhaps there's a bit of generational change as well as they get into more positions of influence, because that's my experience anyway. They tend to be much more inclusive.
I totally agree. I mean, certainly when in my last couple of years at Chelsea, I did quite a bit of recruitment in sort of um, entry level and to mid management, and was meeting a lot of younger people who maybe were second jobbers, third jobbers. That's the first thing that the movement in the market is much swifter. You know, I spent 8 years at Wix and Travis Perkins. I spent 10 years at Labrets, and I think that type of, although I had different roles and I was very lucky, I got some great opportunities. I think, you know, people won't stay in organizations for long periods of time. I think they'll move around a lot more. I think they look for that excitement of a new experience. So I think that's one thing. But I think you're absolutely right. When I was talking and interviewing, um, the people that I was chatting to were also interviewing me about equality, diversity, inclusion, sustainability, you know, corporate social responsibility, which is very different to interviewing 10, 15 years ago. And so there was just a lot more of a social context, a lot more around, was the organization doing the right things? What was the plan? How are they going to make sure that it was a more inclusive and sustainable environment over the long term? And so the questions that were being asked were super intelligent questions and very insightful, I think, for what younger people, younger generations coming into the workforce are looking for these days versus perhaps, you know, when I was the equivalent age. I don't think I probably asked any of those questions. In fact, I absolutely know I didn't. So it's a really different dynamic now, and I think you're absolutely right. The challenge is that the upper echelons of organisations are still somewhat one-dimensional in terms of the types of people that are running large organisations, and so that you've then got this blocker to change. And that will mean that those younger people are looking for something more inclusive, more sustainable, more thoughtful, you know, employers. But you've still got some of the power base is still quite one-dimensional in terms of creating that
Yeah.
change.
And therefore, it's no surprise. I mean, the companies that are moving fastest in that way are those that are consumer based, because the consumers, you know, younger people with that mindset have money to spend, and you know, therefore they understand that in spite of how they feel internally, they'll alienate their customers. And there's a lot of companies moving down things like B Corp certification and having much more evolved ESG strategies because, you know, not because of the right reason necessarily, but because their customers will abandon them if they don't do that. If they don't, you know, like, you know, anything from they taking sugar out of breakfast cereal, you know, to you know, the environment and people's impact on the environment. You know, companies are very conscious of that. So, you know, it's influencing the world of work because it's changing the way companies function. So, you know, more often than not, that's going to be one of the drivers. Although I wish it was perhaps both ways, you know, that from the top down they see it that way. If we get there in the end, it doesn't really matter, I guess. Um, can I ask you one last question? We ask everyone this question, and it's just curious. You know, there's no right or wrong answer, but if you weren't doing what you were doing today, what would you be doing?
Yeah, it's really funny. I would this is completely different from what I do today, but I would be an architect if I wasn't an EDI specialist. I absolutely love buildings, history, creating environments that people want to kind of live in or be in. And yeah, it's really funny because my husband and I have been talking about, like, what job would you have if you didn't have the job you do? And it would definitely, for me, it would be architect. So yes, I don't know why. I'm not even sure if I could do it. You probably have to be really good at maths, but yeah, that would be
That,
really.
that's pretty cool. I mean, normally, you know, not normally, people say, like, I've had a few people I've asked say DJ and things like that. But do you think maybe the older you get, the more creative, or I've become more interested in things now than I was ever interested in before? Um, I don't know why. I've just sort of started to, you know, that I find it more interesting. Whereas before, when I was younger, you know, kicking a ball around or whatever pretty much dominated most of my non-work time. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, even me, I think, you know what, I'd love to do things that I've got no skills in. Find them way more interesting.
Yeah, do you know what? I think you do become more interested in stuff, and I think it's interesting what you say about the B Corps, because I was looking for a pair of sunglasses, and there's this great brand called Sun God who are a B Corp, and they do a lot of surfers against sewage and all sorts of things. And I was completely absolutely loved the brand. Bought my sunglasses from them. Everybody loves the sunglasses, and I've sort of talked about them a lot. But one of the things that actually genuinely attracted me to them was their kind of B Corp. I was like, oh, good for them. That's really cool. They're thinking about society. They're doing things a bit differently. They're quite a small business, and so I think I've changed my perceptions, or my I'm just more interested in the background of things rather than, maybe I'm less superficial as I've got older.
Yeah. Don't change too much, Sarah. We love you how you are. Anyway, look. Now, Sarah, look, thank you so much for coming on. It'd be great to get you back at a future point to talk about some of these issues in more depth.